Welcome everyone, our members and our guests to today's lunchtime lecture. And a very warm welcome to our guest speaker, His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko, Ukrainian Ambassador to Australia. Ukraine is the second largest country in the continent of Europe, second only to Russia. Smaller than New South Wales, with a population almost 5 times that of New South Wales and nearly double that of the Commonwealth of Australia. With a long and complex history, 1,000 years in the making, it has long been the principal agricultural area of Europe. Its capital, Kiev, was founded in 482. Yet in another sense, it's a very young country, having become an independent state when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. When Russian forces began to roll towards the Ukrainian border on the evening of Defender of the Fatherland Day, 23 February 2022, Moscow was anticipating the capture of Kiev within 3 days and having control of Ukraine by Victory Day, which is on the 9th of May. It was not to be. The Russian military was repulsed. It has since suffered colossal losses in personnel and military equipment. However, it still occupies Ukrainian territory. It continues to press its numerical advantage and appears to be waging a war of attrition at great cost to both sides. Yet in the words of Ukraine's haunting but very moving national anthem, Ukraine's freedom has not yet perished, nor has her glory. Your Excellency, it's a great honour to have you with us today. While I would suggest that many a diplomat in Canberra outside of the diplomatic circle would be faceless to most Australians, not so our guest, who would be known and admired by many in this room, indeed by many in our country, for his tireless efforts promoting the Ukrainian cause. He's a familiar face on our news screens. So familiar, in fact, that it's hard to believe that he only assumed the functions of the Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia on the 1st of April 2022, having briefly served as an advisor to the Minister of Defence of Ukraine just prior to his appointment, and before that having served as a member of the Supervisory Board of the Ukrainian Institute, a cultural diplomacy outfit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, he was an active business and civil society leader in Ukraine, a partner of a Kiev-based strategic communications company, co-founder, chairman and board member of various non-government organisations, amplifying Ukraine's voice internationally, mobilising talent for the economic, legal and judicial reforms in Ukraine, and President of the European Youth Parliament, Ukraine. Please welcome His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko to the podium.
Tim Turner, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be here at the Anzac Memorial to deliver the lecture, or actually my talk here today. Thanks a lot for a turnout. I'm really impressed by the number of people who showed up, and it's a great pleasure. Look, I will just share with you my story, and we'll try to cover as much ground as possible, but I would welcome your questions following 30 or 40 minutes of my talk. I would be very pleased to answer your questions, so please keep them in mind, raise your hand, and when we are done, I actually like these interactive sessions even much more than just a regular talk. But look, I will probably start on the day when it all started, and I will never forget that moment when I was still in Ukraine when the war broke out, and you wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my wife wakes me up and says, look, I hear explosions, the war has started. And this is probably one of the most scary moments in your life which you could never forget. Because in a way, for a long time, following 3 months before that, and following all this build-up of the Russian troops, there were many discussions in Ukraine and elsewhere, will Russians invade? And a lot of analysis was out there that it's not going to happen. This is part of the strategic ambiguity. This is a way to intimidate Ukraine, to force Ukraine into some concessions. And it was quite amazing how all these discussions and discourse was going on. In fact, I was just 2 weeks before the major invasion, I was participating in a discussion on the French-Ukrainian relations, and there was an event organized by one of the leading top foreign policy think tanks called IFRI in Paris. And at that time already, it was pretty much, the US government was very clear that Russians are invading, and we have all the confirmation that they're going to do it. But at the same time, many analysts in France, as well as the government in France, for instance, were not convinced. And the same was actually the same for the German government. And both countries and all these countries are part of NATO. So for me, it was always, in a way, kind of in a way, mind-boggling in a way, because all these countries had the same intelligence, but the interpretation of that intelligence was different. And I still don't have an answer why was it so. Actually, it was actually chief of the German intelligence service was in Ukraine on the 23rd, and he then ended up, when the war started, he was being rescued and evacuated back home, but it was much more complicated. And in a way, I think what was missing was the way we have interpreted Vladimir Putin and actually his rationality for the invasion. And for him, it looked like a perfect moment. He was looking at the withdrawal of the troops, of the American troops from Afghanistan. He was also looking at the upcoming elections in France and knowing that French will be more focused on their domestic issues. The relationship with Germany was quite solid. German economy heavily depended on the supply of the Russian gas. And of course, we all know that the Putin's game and Putin's plan was of a blitzkrieg, to take Ukraine over in 2 weeks or faster, and that's it. Now, 2 years and 4 months later, we're still standing there. And of course, we can only look at that and see what was that out there that helped us go on. But I think what Putin has underestimated, he underestimated the resilience of the Ukrainian people to fight, our willingness to get united, and our ability to sacrifice our lives to defend the country. And this is something that he was missing. He was missing the proper intelligence out there. What would be the reaction of the Ukrainian people? Probably the information he had that he will be greeted with flowers, but it didn't happen. And I think that was that moment of unity that all Ukrainians get really united. It was a true leadership of President Zelensky, who was out there and was able to communicate to Ukrainians from day one. And I think that legendary video that he's recorded, holding his phone and looking into the camera, having his team out there, he said, "I'm here, my team is here, and we're here to fight." And a bit later he said that I don't need a right, I need ammunition. And I think it was a very clear message to the international community, to all our partners, to actually come up with support for Ukraine. Of course, we wouldn't be able to withstand this brutal attack without the support of over 50 nations who have actually come together to help Ukraine, to rescue Ukraine. But now I would like to take you a little bit further into the history and talk a little bit about 20th century history to give you more of an idea of how we ended up where we ended up now. But just looking, I won't go back to medieval history, though we know that Vladimir Putin is very fascinated with medieval history. But at the same time, I just want to look at the 20th century history so that you would know a little bit more. But the relationship between Ukraine and Russia should be looked from standpoint of colonialism, where Ukraine was just part of the Russian colony, and whatever the Russian policies on Ukraine were that one of a colonizer. In 1917, following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, as well as the end of the World War as it was coming to an end, Ukraine became an independent state. A Ukrainian National Republic was proclaimed. It was in 1917. And for the next 4 years, we had several governments in place until 1921. And that was probably the modern-day statehood that Ukraine enjoyed. But in 1921, the communists and Bolsheviks came, they crushed our independence, and they have created Soviet Union. In the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet leadership and Stalin has undertaken a major collectivization plan, basically forcing people to join collective farms. For every Ukrainian, owning a piece of land was extremely important. That was almost sacred thing, to have a piece of land, and they wouldn't want to give up that land to the state, and they really resisted heavily to those collectivization policies of the Soviet Union. To punish Ukrainians for their resistance, Stalin has organized one of the biggest famines and man-made famines in the world history. As a result of that famine in 1932 and 1933, over 5 million Ukrainians have died. And it was just horrible. People were deprived of the food that they had. They were deprived of any seats that they had in house. And just people just starved to death. In 1937, Stalin has organized major repression against any public intellectuals in Ukraine. He's done it as well as in other parts of the Soviet Union, but Ukraine was heavily targeted because Ukraine was seen as a source of nationalism, a source of resistance to the Soviet rule. And to actually nip it in the bud, he executed and a lot of the Ukrainian writers, composers, as we now call them, key opinion leaders in a way, who were really sent to gulags or actually just killed. That was a way to actually subdue any kind of resistance. In 1939, Stalin has colluded with Nazi Germany and basically is to blame for the start of the Second World War, following the secret pact that was signed between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. They have invaded the Baltic nations as well as invaded Eastern Poland at that time, and basically that was the start of the Second World War at a major scale. Of course, Stalin did not expect for the Nazis to come back and actually invade the Soviet Union in 1941, but it did come. And for the next 4 years, a lot of the battlefield was taking place in Ukraine. For the Ukrainian nation, it's probably suffered more than any other nation in those days, because if we estimate that the losses of the Soviet losses in the Second World War go up to 26 million, at least 12 million of those were of Ukrainians who died in the Second World War. So you can imagine the level of trauma that the country had to go through, I mean, in that period of time, but especially during the Second World War. The Soviet Union was an evil empire, and it couldn't last long. The economy didn't work. The decision to invade Afghanistan in the 80s, and also as well as the Chernobyl disaster, all of that has precipitated the demise of the Soviet Union. And that really collapsed in the late 80s, and in the early 90s it all fell apart, and Ukraine became an independent nation in 1991. And for us, for Ukrainians, it was a moment to celebrate, because a lot of, through generations, the aspirations for our statehood was out there. It was heavily subdued, it was heavily oppressed, but our aspiration to be an independent nation was there. And as it was all collapsing, it was an opportunity for Ukraine to become an independent nation. What has happened after that, and I think this is, of course, not going deeper into what happened in Russia, what happened in Ukraine, but all the different countries have kind of gone on their own paths, having its own problems of the transitional economies, the emergence of the oligarchs, corruption, and some major other different issues that all these transitional economies were going through. But with the rise of Vladimir Putin, when he became a president of Russia, he's kind of gone on a different road, and I think he always had that in mind of admitting that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest tragedy for him, because at the times of the Soviet Union of the Cold War, Soviet Union was feared, Soviet Union was respected, and he felt like that he lost that respect because nobody was really scared of the Soviet Union. And in a way, what also happened, that Soviet Union never kind of gone through that period of reckoning of what had happened during the Soviet times, on how evil the empire was, and it was no period of actually going through that public discourse within the country, or in a way re-education and actually sharing how bad the Soviet system was. More so actually under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, especially in the past 15 years. Stalin was in a way revived as a ruthless but a justified leader of the Soviet Union, which was quite bizarre given that he was even he was denounced by the Communist Party in 1961. The way he was resurrected from that period of time was actually because of the aspirations of Vladimir Putin of creating somebody he could follow through. Russia has invaded Georgia in 2008. And this is something which is often missed out there in the discussions. And in a way, that invasion, that Russia has occupied 20% of the Georgian territory at that time, has further emboldened him, because the sanctions which were imposed on Russia, they were not strong enough, they were maybe weak. And in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine initially, grabbed Crimea, invaded eastern parts of Ukraine, this is what really emboldened Putin to actually carry on further. The reaction was out there, and especially if you look at Georgia, whatever happened after Georgia's invasion, and we could just look at the map, U.S. government tried to reset policy with Russia. It all failed. It was a reset that was driven by Obama, and then it all changed. And then when they invaded Ukraine, initially, and of course one of the most tragic parts, and especially for Australians, that was the downing of the MH17. And Russians have brought in the Buk system, which is an air defense system, into Ukraine, and they have targeted a civilian aircraft that was passing through the territory of Ukraine and killed 298 people on board, including 38 Australians. We'll soon be commemorating this in Canberra, but Russians have to be held responsible for the crimes that they have committed, and they have to be held to the account. And as you know, though we already have the decisions of the courts in the Netherlands, but we still need to make sure that Russians are held accountable. So those 8 years, we've had this war, and it was not so much in the news. There was a lot about the war in the early days in 2014 and 2015, but Russians have really been focusing on beefing up their military. They've been allocating more money to their defense industry, and they were preparing for that perfect moment when to come back and to invade Ukraine at a much different scale. So I have to admit, so when that moment came on the 24th of February 2022, I was also among those who did not believe that Russians would actually come with such a major offensive. And we thought that they would try to capture more territory in the east, but we didn't expect them to actually come from 3 different sides, from the north, from the east, and from the south. But they did. And of course, for me personally, and just remembering those days of how you try to pack up your stuff, get your family in the car, trying to leave the city. And at that time, you can imagine, city is 3.5 million people, and everybody's trying to leave the city, and everybody gets stuck in a huge traffic jam. There is no gas at the petrol stations. And I've seen it in those films on Hollywood movies where they show kind of a catastrophe and everybody's trying to escape. It was very, you felt like you were in some sort of blur, or it was very, you couldn't think straight because you couldn't believe that it was actually happening to us. One of the most striking moments was for me when I took my family to Western Ukraine, where my parents live, and we spent some time there, and then my family asked me, can you evacuate us outside of the country because we don't feel safe? My 5-year-old son got really traumatized by the explosions he heard. My 18-year-old daughter was also quite in distress. And I've decided to take my family out, and we picked Romania as a place where to go. At that time, the border with Poland was extremely crowded and was difficult to get through. And of course, And then a friend of mine reached out to me, and he was from Romania. I calculated that probably the fastest way would be to get them to the border, have them cross the border on foot, and my friend would meet them on the other side. And I was still left behind. At that time, I was in the middle of my appointment to come here to Australia, but I didn't know for sure if it was going to come through, because nobody knew what was going to happen. And it was interesting when they made it to Romania, my son, who was still very young, but he was asking my wife, or why are we here? Why are we in Romania? And my wife, as also a student of international relations, she was explaining to a kid that, look, Romania is part of NATO and Russians will not invade Romania, so we are in a safe place. So fast forward 3 weeks later, we all now come to Australia, and my son asks, is Australia part of NATO? Will Russians invade? And he doesn't know what is NATO, but he just made that click. He made that connection that Romania was protected, and is Australia protected or not? But look, I think that was. I want to describe to you what's happened militarily for the past 2 years, because I think it's very important to look at the dynamics of what was happening and how we were able to actually withstand that attack. And some people say it was a miracle, others believe that it was, the bravery of the Ukrainian people that has helped us to withstand that brutal Russian attack. But since 2022, we've been able to push Russians out from 50% of the territory which they have originally occupied. And as we have, as Russian troops were defeated on the outskirts of Kiev, we have discovered confirmations of massive war crimes and crimes against humanity which Russians have committed out there, which would include rape, summary executions, torture, and later, as we would find out, abduction of the Ukrainian children, which were happening at a massive scale, and whatever they were doing. Part of the strategy, but there was a strategy behind that, and the strategy was to actually terrorize civilian population and actually make them give up their resistance. And that was part of the big intimidation strategy which Russians have come up with. But I think once the discovery of these heinous crimes, the world community was shocked seeing that happening, and there was a very strong reaction to that, and that was one of the reasons. But apart from just a reason to support an underdog, a country which has been attacked, was really has intensified the support coming to Ukraine, and all the platforms which were unlocked to Ukraine, they've been making a difference. The tanks which were provided, the air defense systems, the artillery, they all have made a difference in the battlefield. Some believe that we have been just getting enough not to be defeated, but not enough to prevail. It still stands there. As of course we wouldn't be able to withstand without that support, but at the same time, some of the equipment which is coming, and it's not coming in time, and it's at a high cost to the Ukrainians at the moment. We've been able to achieve major success in the Black Sea by pushing Russians out from the Black Sea, pretty much destroying 50% of the Black Sea Navy, even without having a navy on our own. And we've been able to push Russians out to the eastern part of the Black Sea, and really have cleared up the way for the export of our food products to Ukraine. Ukrainian counteroffensive in the northern summer of last year did not go well, to be frank, for 3 different reasons. Russians had about 9 months before that. They have heavily dug in, built 3 lines of defense. Everything was heavily mined, and it was very difficult to go through. We didn't have enough of the right tools. We didn't have enough of the clear mining equipment. But also, the minute you are there on the field, you just get hammered with all the intensive artillery, Russian artillery. We didn't have the fighter jets at the moment. We still don't have them. We hope they will be available sometime in the next 3 months, as well as the right tools to be able to go through. Nevertheless, it's now 2 years and 4 months. We're still standing. It was that was the unity of the Ukrainian people that I was amazed by, not only myself, but I think the rest of the world. And I have never seen anything of that sort in Ukraine's history. It was really, truly a birth of a Ukrainian nation where everybody got united, where everybody got together. You know, you've seen the footage probably of the farmers stealing tractors, stealing tanks with their tractors, or people with disabilities making Molotov cocktails, or all those volunteer groups who rallied together and who've been supplying those food or any kind of assistance to the people at the front lines. Ukrainian volunteers are still out there crowdfunding globally for drones or for any other equipment they can source globally. Ukrainians are extremely grateful for the support they've seen from Australia. And I think that was, like, for me, when I just got here, and it was end of March and early April, presenting the credentials, I was able to see at the time it was coalition government in place, and I was really amazed by the swift reaction. And I was in the parliament building when President Zelensky spoke and addressed two chambers of your parliament, and where he asked for help, and he specifically asked for bushmasters. And that was probably one of the fastest military assistance that was provided in the history of Australia, at least at what I was told. Because if you can imagine that it was morning when President spoke in Ukraine, it was evening here, late afternoon here, and next day when Prime Minister Scott Morrison was speaking to the media, he actually provided a confirmation that those bushmasters will be dispatched. It was still the same day in Ukraine when the news broke out that they will be coming. And I think since that time, bushmasters have become really a symbol and an icon of the Australian support to Ukraine. Previously, when people would think about Australia in Ukraine, they would come to typical stereotypes like kangaroos and koalas. But now Bushmaster as a brand is known in Ukraine as much as of those unique animals you have. And I've tested it myself. I was able to visit Ukraine 7 times since my arrival here. So every time, you're in a taxi and you start a conversation, people hear about a connection to Australia, they ask about bushmasters. Now, 120 of those have been supplied to Ukraine, and they have been saving many lives. They've proved to be very efficient, a bit because of its design, the way they are protected from beneath, and they are very good at withstanding the landmines and providing the protection for the movement of our personnel and on the trips. I was very pleased that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was able to come to Ukraine, and it was only his 5th week actually on the job. And I remember when I initially started testing with the Department of Foreign Affairs, would there be a chance for him to visit Ukraine? At that time he was scheduled to go to Madrid to visit the NATO summit there. And the response that I was getting was kind of unknown or unlikely, because it was only his initial several weeks on the job, and making a trip to Ukraine didn't look like something possible. But I was very pleased that soon that decision was reversed, and pretty much 5 weeks later I ended up going to Ukraine with him, and he spent there 1 day, but it was a very important day for him. He was taken to Bucha and Irpin. These are the cities on the outskirts of Kiev, which were just liberated from the Russians 3 months before that. And I was there with him, and we were taken to this place at the church, and there were photographs and a place that were shown. There was a mass burial of the people of Bucha who were killed and executed. And even for me, who knew the story, who've been retelling the story to the media, I was really shocked at what I've heard there. And once you've seen it, once you've seen those photographs, once you heard those witness accounts, this is something you can never forget. And I was pleased that Prime Minister was able to do this trip, and I'm sure it did have an impact on him. And I was very pleased to see all this support from Australia coming thereafter. Why it's important for Australia to continue supporting Ukraine? Well, firstly, we have to, it's pretty clear Russians have really dismantled the rules-based international system. I mean, if really everything on the rules-based order is now gone, because Russia is a nuclear power state which has attacked a smaller neighbor. More so, it's important to remind you that in 1994, Ukraine has voluntarily given up its nuclear weapons. It was probably the biggest contribution to the global peace in itself. At that time, Ukraine had the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We, of course, can debate was Ukraine capable of maintaining those weapons or not, but we did make that contribution. We gave them up. They were transferred to the US. Some of our strategic bombers were dismantled. And we signed up a document called Budapest Memorandum, and as part of the document, Russia, as well as the US and France and other countries, have actually committed to assure us of our sovereignty and of our territorial integrity, which was blatantly violated by Russia in 2014 and then at much later scale 8 years later. And Russians have really dismantled the world order that existed after the Second World War, because if Ukraine cannot be protected, who can be protected? Now, what's important is sometimes I hear, it's also in Australia, that Ukraine is a long way away from Australia. It's something happening in Europe, and probably Europe has to deal with that. But we have to keep it in mind that it's not about Ukraine, it's about Russia, because Russia is a Pacific country. It is actually much closer than everybody thinks. And as a Pacific nation, if Russia is more successful in Ukraine, it will be more emboldened to assert itself here in the Pacific. To make it clear, Russia is maintaining a large navy, Pacific Navy here, and they have over 260 warships out there, about 24 submarines, including some nuclear submarines as well as about 100 aircraft in their Vladivostok bases. And now we've seen all this intensive cooperation happening with North Korea. The recent visit, the visit of Vladimir Putin to Russia last week, and actually an agreement, a security agreement that was signed, is a wake-up call for Australia, because definitely Russia is demonstrating that they are interested in disrupting the Pacific as well. And I think what's the biggest problem here is, of course, maritime security and the navigation, free navigation of the sea, and actually disrupting your key trading partners, Japan and South Korea. So there is a great deal at stake out there for Australia, making sure that we can win this war, because it becomes a part of your regional security and part of your regional priorities, because whatever is happening out there, it will have an implication here in the region. And there is no two Russians, there is just one Russia. No one Russia which is, invading a neighbor out there in Europe, and a very friendly Russia here in the Pacific. It's the same Russia, and we already see from that cooperation with North Korea how closely it is done. Allegedly, North Koreans have supplied 5 million rounds of ammunition. They also supplied some ballistic missiles which were used against Ukraine. But also we don't know what Russians are providing in exchange. Will they be helping North Koreans with further with the nuclear program or with other ballistic programs? How much of that technical assistance will be provided and technical expertise that Russians have committed to? But definitely we already see an emboldened Russia which is undermining global security, which is undermining the regional security here as well. Look, what we are fighting for. We are fighting for freedom. We are fighting for human rights. We are fighting for rule of law. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has really created massive problems internationally. And one of those most acute problems is food security. Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of food globally. We produce 10% of the global output of wheat, 17% of barley, and we supply 50% of the sunflower oil globally. So many countries in the Middle East and Africa depend on the supply of food from Ukraine. Initially, when the Russians invaded us, we were prevented from the export, and we've seen the surge in prices for food. We've seen starvation in the eastern parts of Africa, and also many countries dependent. And we've even seen the surge in prices for fish and chips in Australia, for that matter, as the price for vegetable oil has gone up. And the major reason for that was, for instance, the fact that we couldn't export our sunflower oil to the global markets. We've seen the increased price for energy resources, and the major shift in the priority of many other of different governments towards national security. because for many nations, especially with large populations, the price of food and the price of energy is a very sensitive topic. For instance, for a country which is next door here, like Indonesia, which has 275 million people, the price of oil and the price of food is very sensitive. A lot of food was coming also from Ukraine to Indonesia, but at the end of the day, for big countries with large populations, it's been kind of the key issues. So the sooner we can this war can end, the sooner we'll be able to return to a proper global commodity markets and to more stability and predictability. In a way, Australia has benefited from this war. I mean, it was, of course, an inadvertent benefit with the rising prices for food as well as for commodities. The budget surplus in Australia of last year, and the main reason was, was actually the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was driven by the prices for shale gas, the prices for iron ore, and as well as wheat. We've seen the same for oil prices, and I think that also is an additional case of why Australia can and should do more to support Ukraine at the moment, given all the kind of regional priorities and given what is at stake at the moment. What's the cost of this war? The cost of this war is extremely high. We now estimate that we have 300,000 people with disabilities, which was caused by war. We have over 5 million people who are now displaced in Europe. These are primarily women with children. We have another 7 million who've been internally displaced. We now estimate that 25% of the Ukrainian territory is mined and will need a long time to clear the territory from those mines. We've seen a huge impact on the Ukrainian environment. As you know, wars are toxic and even explosives. These are the chemicals which make and pollute our soil and our water. The deliberate destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, which was a big dam, and the hydropower station in Ukraine last year has really created a catastrophe in the southern part of Ukraine by flooding large spots of the country. That water has hit many fertilizer storage places as well as landfills, and it's really polluted large parts of Ukraine, and also parts of agricultural land in the south. Lots of destruction to Ukrainian natural parks. So it's in a way it's an ecocide that has been happening in Ukraine, in a way an environmental catastrophe which is ongoing on the continuous basis. Most importantly, it has a huge impact on the people of Ukraine, the trauma of war, and the way society, though still remaining resilient, but as we go on and this war drags on, the more destruction we see, the more difficult it becomes. And I could just, speak it even on myself, because having been here now for 2 years, 3 months or 4 months, I was able to go to Ukraine, as I said before, 7 times. So for me, it was always also very important to understand what's happening on the ground, to assess the public sentiment, and to see the evolution of that. And when I was there recently in January, I've seen that change of mood in a way, and how people are reacting. We also have to keep in mind that for every Ukrainian who wakes up today and kind of looks in his phone, checks the social media, a lot of the social media has turned into obituaries, because we wake up and we read about the relatives of our friends or their close ones or somebody they knew who got either wounded or got killed in the front lines. And it's ongoing now for such a long period of time. So the issue of mental trauma and will be one of the key issues for us to deal with for a long period of time. Russians have deliberately been trying to destroy our power generation and electricity distribution. It's, as you know, according to the international conventions of war, these are war crimes that Russians have been committing. But that's been now ongoing for 2.5 years, and they have pretty much destroyed 50% of our energy infrastructure. And the main goal of this is to put pressure on the Ukrainian civilian population so that they could put pressure on Ukraine to stop resisting the Russian invasion. Now we see blackouts in many different cities. Cities go dark. Major impact on Ukraine's economy as industry is trying to keep up with those blackouts, because it's difficult to run your business if you don't have electricity supply. And so this is something we are going through. more recently, Ukraine still believes there is a chance for diplomacy in a way, and that was the reason why Ukraine has convened a major peace conference. And the idea of this peace conference was to renew trust towards the international law, to renew trust to the UN Charter, and the Ukrainian leadership has invited 160 countries to come and join the Peace Summit, which was in Switzerland last week, 10 days ago. And we had 101 representatives there, over 90 countries, and also representatives of international organizations who showed up. We were able to demonstrate to Russia, and Russia was not invited to this event, that we have the majority of the world, and all countries were represented of all 5 different continents. There were also many members and representatives of the Global South. And we wanted to demonstrate to Russia that there are issues out there which are very important, and we have the support and the global solidarity with Ukraine. The meeting was focused primarily on 3 themes. One theme was related to food security. Another one was related to nuclear safety and radiation safety, as well as to humanitarian issues related to the exchange of the prisoners of war and return of the Ukrainian children. Nuclear safety is one of the key top priorities for us. Russians have held the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, actually, which is in Ukraine, as a hostage. And there is a high chance that anything can happen to that power plant, and it can go into a meltdown. And that would be a major catastrophe, not only for Ukraine, but also for big parts of Europe. And it was important to emphasize to Russia that it's it's inadmissible for them to use nuclear as a way to threaten us and keep the civilian infrastructure site as a blackmail, basically, of Ukraine. So there was a call on Russia to stop doing it. Look, I think I covered lots of ground. I mean, I could have missed many different parts, but I think this is we're getting there to the moment where I'll be welcoming your questions and happy to take them. So feel free to ask anything you have in mind. I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our hearts go out to you and your family and your people. I read it's a critical time now, as the US election is early November, just over 4 months away. How can the war be won by that date? Would it require simply extra munitions or other troops on the ground from NATO? And would Russian allies join it in that case? It's a terrible conundrum.
It is. It's not an easy one, and of course we all understand that whatever the outcome of the elections in the US will be, we still believe that for the US to support Ukraine is not in a party interest, but is a national interest to support us. So we will rely on the support of America, no matter who's there as the president. If Donald Trump will become a president, there is kind of something interesting that I want to kind of remind the public. Is that when he was the president first time, that was when he authorized the transfer of the anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, the Javelins, and it was under his leadership that we received them. And those Javelins actually played a major decisive role, especially in the initial days of the Russian invasion, where we were able to hit the Russian tanks and the Russian columns which were coming into the country. Of course, we don't know, because there will be lots of uncertainty and unpredictability. This is what we will be probably expecting with the Trump's leadership. Now, what's important for Ukraine at the moment is, of course, getting the military assistance we need, and ammunition is probably number one priority. We've seen how this invasion of Ukraine has really exposed the vulnerabilities of the defense industry globally, and now it's extremely difficult to catch up with the demand in Ukraine. And of course, that pause of assistance from America for the past 6 months has really enabled Russia to open a new offensive, for instance, in Kharkiv region, because once you are starved of ammunition, this is what the enemy sees, and the enemy jumps on that opportunity, and this is what we've seen Russians actually doing. But also, it's important for Ukraine to get sufficient number of air defense systems, as well as artillery shells, as well as fighter jets. I think the fighter jets, they can actually play a major role and be a game changer in the battlefield, but also long-range missiles. And now that we're also able to hit some of the targets in Russia, we've seen how it all affected the Russian offensive now in Kharkiv region, where we're able to hit some of their command posts in Russia, or some of their troops stationed just outside in the Russian territory, and it really has stalled their offensive at the moment. But of course, the most important thing, of course, for our victory is to demonstrate that unity, that the countries stand together with Ukraine to withstand that attack. We do believe Russians' casualties are very high. I mean, we estimate that about 540,000 of the Russian soldiers were either killed or wounded. So the number is staggering if you just look at it, and not any other country would be able to sustain it. But because Russia has turned into a totalitarian country and totalitarian system, they're still capable of maintaining that through their propaganda, through the work with any resistance from within Russia. But it's in a way, this war that Russians have started, this is what's going to bring down the regime in Russia, the regime of Vladimir Putin. It's just a matter of time when it's going to happen. And of course, we cannot bet our strategy on his demise, but definitely the things which can really change the situation is demonstrating that Ukraine can fight back, that Ukraine can take, for instance, Crimea back, and Crimea is probably one of those weak spots for Russia, because a lot of the Russian myth around invasion of Ukraine was based on that myth of getting Crimea back into the Russian territory, which is a big celebration, a part of a major propaganda effort of what itself. If we can demonstrate that to Russians that Crimea is untenable, that can really precipitate the demise of Vladimir Putin, which will eventually come. We all know all the dictators collapse, but it just, of course, is a matter of time when it's going to happen. How many more Ukrainians will be killed? Thank you.
Peter Morosigi, Aerospace Consulting. Your Excellency, it was a very illuminating speech and lecture, I should say. What I'd like to know is which industry has survived the best in Ukraine and which has suffered the most? That's one question. The other one is, with aircraft M225, how's the reconstruction of that aeroplane going, if any at all?
In terms of the industries that have survived, probably the most robust industry in Ukraine is IT and IT services. Ukraine has 300,000 software engineers, and they have been actually operating even under the circumstances we live in. Last year, IT industry has accounted for about $7 billion of US dollars of income, revenue for the country, and it's growing. It's probably the only sector which is currently growing despite the war. You will be surprised, but many Australian companies still use Ukrainian IT engineers for their backup, as their backup offices, and the work which is provided remotely. For instance, Atlassian is one of those which has a big team in Ukraine. Canva is also using teams in Ukraine, and many other companies. For instance, a publicly listed company, Australian company called Aristocrat, it employs 1,000 people in Ukraine. The whole team, which is producing games for phones, is actually based in Ukraine, which is still operating and is creating video games, for instance. Agriculture has suffered. It's difficult for agriculture. We're able to export, but it's not at the amount and levels that we used to export, right? And we have pretty much, by inflicting damage to the Russian Black Sea Navy, we've created a corridor for the export of our products. But it's still more expensive. It's also the matter of insurance for those logistics companies to provide. And it's not an easy one. Also, farmers have suffered because all the big traders, so these are usually international companies, they're hedging their risks, and therefore the price on the domestic market is extremely low for the farmers. So it's extremely difficult for them to actually make any profit, and they often have to sell at the cost because it will either perish, and we don't have enough of the grain storage facilities, because usually what we had that was kind of built on a cycle. You get new one, you sell, and you kind of stretch it. But once you have a pile up of the products and you don't have anywhere to store, the prices tumble and you have to sell at a very discounted price to make sure you can still get any money out of it. So the agriculture sector suffered, but it's still working, it's still operating, and where possible, of course, where there is no battlefield. Heavy industry is suffered, like in Kharkiv, for instance, a city which is also a big industrial city, and Kharkiv is probably now getting hammered more than any other city, big city in Ukraine on the continuous basis, so it's difficult. We've been able to kind of, our defense industry is still operating, though Russians have been targeting that as well. We are now welcoming more cooperation with other defense industry companies globally, trying to get them going. But of course, generally, with a limited supply of electricity, or the fact that we have to balance off the supply of electricity, is making it difficult for many Ukrainian industries, right? And those which operate, we make everything sure that the economy is still functioning. But you will be surprised, when the war started, for instance, there was a prediction that banking system would collapse, but it didn't. It's still operating, right? There was no run on the banks. Also, Ukrainian government was able to introduce a digital transformation program. In 2019, when President Zelensky was elected, our Deputy Prime Minister Fedorov actually rolled out a major digital transformation program, which was a digital ID, which is in your phone and which includes your passport, your tax documents, your driving license, and that application turned out to be extremely helpful when the war broke out, because once we got all those displaced people in Europe, that digital ID, which 80% of the population now had on their phones, has enabled them to stay close to Ukrainian government. Public services were continued. You could open a bank account remotely without showing up in the bank. You could start a company also remotely, but having that program rolled out. And it actually was been extremely successful in terms of making sure that the society can function and public services could be provided, for instance, right? Yeah, thank you.
The aircraft?
Oh, the aircraft. Look, the aircraft. It was a jewel that we were so proud of, and Maria aircraft, the largest cargo airplane in the world. It was the only one that was out there. Australians have seen it. It came to Perth, I think, in 2017, and delivering some of the goods that were provided. It often was deployed as an aircraft to deliver humanitarian assistance to African countries, to Asian countries, especially after some major calamities that were happening, and that airplane was out there. Rebuilding that probably, we'll have to build it from scratch. I'm not sure if it could be repaired. I was there with the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese at the site to see the remnants of that aircraft. Of course, there is an investigation in Ukraine. How come that aircraft was still there when the Russians came? Because there are a lot of questions. What was behind it? I mean, why wasn't the plane taken out of Ukraine before that invasion? And there are still many questions to be answered, but definitely it's a major lost asset, and we all are very sorry it all happened, because it was really kind of a symbol for Ukraine to have that aircraft. We're very proud of it.
Richard Smolenski, I'm a new member of the Institute. Ambassador, it was a very heartfelt and informative speech or lecture. Two things, part of my question. Recently, the UN, the EU and NATO agreed to take Russian-seized assets around the world. Australia's part of that. I personally don't think we're doing enough, but that's another matter. How important is that to assist the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government to supply weaponry and other infrastructure you need to sustain the Russian invasion? And the second part of that, do you think Australians as citizens in our private capacity can do more in our own arenas to keep that pressure on our governments and others?
Thank you. The question of the Russian assets is very important because we now There are about 300 billion of the Russian assets, sovereign assets abroad. Most of them are in Europe. And there have been lots of discussions at the high level, primarily driven by the G7 countries as well as the EU, on how those assets could be used for the benefit of Ukraine. Because forcing a nuclear country to pay for the damage that they've done is not an easy one. And actually those Russian assets which are now immobilized could be a way to punish Russia for what they've done. And that could be the major investment into the future deterrence as we move on. The decision that was made 2 weeks ago at the G7 meeting was to actually provide a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, which is backed by the proceeds, backed by the interest which is generated from those seized assets. And it's a big positive development, and those money will be used to support Ukrainian budget, but also support Ukraine for the procurement of defense and whatever energy needs we may have. In terms of support, it's each one of you can contribute. Write a letter to your member of parliament, write a letter to your senator asking for support for Ukraine. You can also be active in social media supporting the country. You can make a donation. There are several Australian-based charities which are raising money for Ukrainian humanitarian needs. One of them is driven by Rotary of Australia, together with the Australian-Ukrainian Federation called Ukraine Crisis Appeal. There is another Australian-based charity called Future Ukraine, which has also been raising money for Ukrainian humanitarian needs. And so there are many different ways of how you can do it, how you can contribute. And apparently there are also a direct way how you can chip in. There is, it's called United 24, which is a platform online. And this United 24 was launched by President Zelensky 2 years ago. And you can directly support Ukrainian healthcare needs. You can support Ukraine's education. You can also make a donation to Ukraine's military needs if you feel like it. And you can do it directly and securely from Sydney, for instance, and you can definitely do it. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Yuri Stoyenko. I immigrated to Australia with my family when I was 14, born in Odessa, and now I'm just an Australian citizen with Ukrainian background. So one of the things that I wanted to state was that my friend here mentioned about the assets, the Russian assets that were proposed to be seized, and unfortunately due to various legal constraints that they clearly said that they can't be seized, but the interest generated from these assets will be used to help Ukraine, which is a good thing. But my main statement was to say for everyone here, being Australian, I assume not many people were born in Ukraine or just like I was, and I'm very interested in history. I believe that we are now facing a Polish moment back in 1939 when England and France declared war on Germany. They'd just invaded Poland. And for a year nearly, they didn't do anything. It was called the funny wars, everyone knows. And look what happened, right? So what I'm saying is that the ambassador mentioned that there will be a demise of Mr. Putin, and I'm pretty sure that in 1939 there would have been someone somewhere saying that the demise of Hitler is inevitable, and they were both right, but look what happened in between, until the demise actually happened. And that's the point I'm going to make. We're in an extremely dangerous situation. And I think that every member of civilized community should do their utmost to stop Putin. It's not the Russian people, it's Putin that's doing it, because Russian people are the same as Ukrainian people. They're not an evil nation, but the ruling class unfortunately has been. And so that's my point. It's a Polish moment, and if we react like France and England did, we may end up, hopefully not, with 50 million people lost in the Second World War.
Brian Millen, retired. I have a very simple question. You see a lot on YouTube in particular, and on the news, the flashbangs of warfare and war-torn areas. We don't see cyber warfare. You have a very strong IT group. I just wondered what's happening in that field.
Yeah, it's Ukraine is a target of the Russian cyber attacks and has been a target for the past 10 years. And it's been pretty ruthless, to be frank. And in a way that the period of time, those 8 years from 2014 to 2022, a lot of investment has come into our cyber capabilities, but also what was important when the war broke out, it was close cooperation with the private sector that happened. It's Ukrainian private sector, but also international private sector. Our cooperation with companies like Amazon, like Google, and Microsoft, and also a number of other private providers, and helped Ukraine withstand those cyber attacks initially. And I understand there is still lots of work which is ongoing. But I think it was that ability of the government to find the solution and closely cooperate with the private sector which actually helped us to deal with those attacks. Also, something which something that I'm hearing. Everybody was predicting that, of course, the target would be critical infrastructure. In a way, the Soviet legacy of that infrastructure has helped us in that way that it was still kind of quite analogous in a way it's all operated. So once you hit it with a cyber attack, you can often just reload the system and it would work again, right? So that the system which is not as sophisticated as, for instance, some of your systems here, which of course would be more vulnerable to that. This is what helped Ukraine in that stage. But definitely, especially for big data which was stored by government, it was a way how you can secure that data, how you can transfer it to safe locations, and how you can prevent those attacks from happening. But especially those cyber attacks, Russian state-sponsored cyber attacks are global, and they are targeting Australian government a lot. They are targeting your private businesses as well, and it's a clear threat. And a lot of this operations in the gray zone, as they call it, something which is still difficult to prove the affiliation to the state sponsorship. But this is what Russians and as well as Chinese are also doing. But Russians are in particular trying to disrupt many countries by actually doing those attacks.
Yeah. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Sorry, Mark Roberts, RISI member. Here in Australia, we have what we can describe as some brain-dead people who would rather bury military and redundant equipment. Of course, I refer to the type headers. Now, have you approached the Australian government again? Because my information is there's 19 of these in storage in Townsville, in a hangar. Yes, they've been disassembled, but they can be put back together. Would you approach the government again and ask, and we can ship them over like that?
Look, we're here on record. We have a camera here, and I'm grateful, and every Ukrainian is grateful for what we have received from Australia and from Australian government. If there is any equipment which is in surplus and could be provided to Ukraine, we would highly appreciate it. And currently, Ukraine has huge needs in armored personnel carriers to form some new brigades. So we need more of the Bushmasters, we need more of those M113s that's been supplied, any of those Aslavs, the same thing. There are some other helicopters in place, and we will start the discussions about Tiger helicopters. Once they are phased out here, we could make use of them. I think we can move through the type and story. I think we just need to move, it's a decision of the government, and we respect that decision. But something that I'm in constant talks with the Defense Department, as well as all the discussions which are happening between Defense and of Australia and Ukraine. This is seeing what else could be provided, what else is in surplus here which could be given to Ukraine, and especially in light of the huge needs that we have. At the moment, especially when we look at the formation of the new brigades. So one thing is to train the people, and the next thing is to make sure that these brigades have the armored equipment, they have the artillery, they have the protection and the weapons to fight with. And this is something we hope to do more, and we rely on Australian support, and we hope that it will continue.
Can I say on behalf of AUSI New South Wales that it has been a real honour to have you with us today, and thank you very much for your forthright and very moving presentation. And for reminding us, as Elena Zelensky, who's the First Lady of Ukraine, and wife of President Zelensky recently reminded us that although there are great oceans and thousands of kilometres between us, and there are no distances really for war and grief, and if there is aggression somewhere in the world, then no one can feel safe. It is more than 2 years since Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of your homeland, and even as we gather here today, Russia is in the midst of yet another concerted assault on Ukraine's infrastructure and its energy facilities. We can but offer our support and watch with profound admiration the resilience of the people of Ukraine, who against tremendous odds and contrary to many pundits' predictions, continue to resist Russia's aggression. And when I was writing those words, I was actually reminded of Sir Winston Churchill's famous speech to the Canadian Parliament some 2 years after Nazi Germany's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Poland. He was responding to Marshal Petain's comment, who was convinced that Germany would successfully invade Britain as it had done France, and that in 3 weeks Britain would have its neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken, Churchill said, and with impeccable timing, some neck. Can I, as a small token, can I present you with a certificate for 12 months honorary membership of AUSI New South Wales and AUSI PIN, and a scarf for your wife Liliana, who I'm sure does a lot to support you and your 2 young children.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
Appreciate it.